I learned about you years ago from your literature, from the books that you've authored. The Santa Cruz periodical, I think it might have been the Sentinel, had a beautiful piece on the work that you had done, and the artwork on the cover was really captivating and colorful and psychedelic, and that brought me to read your book, The Eighth Circuit Brain, which was a really impactful experience in my life to have read that, and then went on to discover the cinematic work that you've done as a director producer. And I'm just really honored to be able to have the opportunity to sit down with you and have a chat. So thank you very much for taking the time.
Thanks, Devin. Thanks for that wonderful introduction.
Yeah, my pleasure. I know that you wanted to speak on your most recent film, The Vanishing Field. I did watch it yesterday or the day before, and I have to say, when I tell my wife about your work, and you know, I have Angel Tech and Eighth Circuit Brain in my little library here, and you know, from your films, I kind of say in a description, they're like an experience. I mean, in the way that I think people like, you know, maybe a Tarantino film, not to make the comparison, only that when you watch a film of yours, in my opinion, it really does take you on kind of a journey, in my opinion. So I really did enjoy The Vanishing Field, and I'd love to speak with you about it.
Well, thanks very much. The sense of immediacy for me is far more important than immediate gratification. You know, the two are often confused to mean the same thing in the consumerist culture at large. Immediate gratification and not the same as a sense of immediacy. And the way I make my films, from the point of shooting them to the improvisatory quality I work with the actors and also the non-actors. You know, for example, in The Vanishing Field, I worked completely with these Zen Buddhist monks. They're non-actors, because I was really interested in an experiment. I wanted to see if I could actually find a movie conveying the kind of presence and daily routines of life at a Zen monastery, which is actually where most of the film was shot. And to do that in a way that where I wasn't imposing my own words, wasn't imposing my own ideas, but somehow find a way to capture and support the expression of the spirit of the land there, the spirit of the individuals, the monks that were, you know, that have been resident there for 10, 15, 20 years at a time.
Wow. Yeah, in watching the film, there were a couple of sets that really kind of, for lack of a better expression, took my breath away. The steps, that beautiful kind of like concrete statue of the horizontal blocks, you know, at the base of which was a sculpture of a meditating Buddha figure, and certainly the room in which the characters were doing some of their meditative work. Out of curiosity, was the main character, the protagonist as well, a resident monk?
Yeah, Jogan Salzberg, who plays the character of Jacob, the protagonist, he's been a resident of the Great Vow Zen Monastery for 15 years. Wow. And has achieved a certain status within the hierarchy there as a Dharma teacher, as a teacher of the Zen doctrine, if there is such a thing. I don't know if there is, but he gives a series of talks on YouTube based on some of his understandings. And in fact, part of the film was inspired by knowing Jogan, who has worked with me and the group para-theater experiments that I've been conducting over the last 40 years. But he's been working with me over the last maybe year and a half, and so I've gotten to know him a little bit. And I was really inspired by his story as a committed Zen monk living in a monastery, coming into some conflict about where he really belongs. So Jogan is the kind of character who's got one foot in the village and one foot in the monastery all the time. So he's kind of like in between worlds, as a just as a way of life, I guess. And I thought, wow, how fascinating. And so this kind of inspired the direction of the film, where he got to play kind of a version of himself. But what happens to him in the story, in the film, is not really what happened to Jogan as a person. That part of the story is more inspired by an early experience of my own that happened when I was 23 years old, where a spontaneous out of body experience shocked the hell out of me, and pretty much continued to impact my life and continues actually to inspire my films to this day.
That's awesome to hear. Weirdly, I am kind of compelled to share that when I was kind of beside myself brought to your work, and I do kind of choose those words carefully, in that, you know, I didn't consciously make the choice when I was in Santa Cruz in college to, you know, find the kind of literature that you produce and kind of educate myself in that. It was that I was, you know, becoming independent. I was doing a lot of surfing. I was learning about myself, and I too, at that time, and to think back, it might have been right around that same age, to be fair, to be, you know, to be accurate, was having, I mean, for lack of a better word, out of body experiences. And you know, without going off on a tangent and becoming kind of narcissistic, because I do have that tendency, and going so far into my own story, I would love to ask you pointedly about that experience, because it seems like that's a kind of a seminal moment in you becoming a creator and certainly a teacher and an author and a producer. Would you agree with that?
In some ways, I think it was more about how I responded to the shock rather than the shock itself. At the time, I'm trying to understand what triggered the experience, because I wasn't on drugs, but from what I recall, I was in a state of a kind of supreme exhaustion after rehearsing one of my plays. At the time, I was writing and directing my own experimental theater works. And I remember just being completely spent that night and just lying in bed next to my girlfriend at the time, and just closing my eyes. And just in a matter of moments, a series of events occurred internally, which I won't go into here. It's just a kind of personal thing I keep to myself. But what it resulted in was me popping up and out of my physical body, drifting around the room, and taking a look at myself lying in bed next to my girlfriend. And it was revelatory in that I came into a new experience of identity. It was obvious that I wasn't just my physical body, because here I was inhabiting another kind of body, a kind of double, a kind of astral presence body, or I don't know what it was, but it was not my physical body. And that has stayed with me. So, you know, I have this physical body, I inhabit the physical body, but I haven't really been able to identify myself as my physical body since that time. And so it's not as if I feel divided in myself. It's more about since when the experience happened, I had already been artistically and creatively active for about 7 years. This happened when I was 23, and I started living my life as an artist pretty much around the age of 16, 17. And so I had a background of using my personal experiences as the material and the wellspring for my creative output. And so it becomes this ongoing, almost autobiographical process. But I'm also kind of shy around exposing the actual details of my personal life. And, you know, I'm not that much of a exhibitionist. I am somewhat exhibitionistic, but not that much. So I use a kind of camouflage filtering process for sharing my personal experiences in a way that might find empathy with others, so that it's not so much about me, but it's about the viewer's own experiences, that they walk away from my movies feeling more of themselves, coming more into their memories, coming more into their feelings, coming more into their thoughts about things, so that they walk away not really filled up with my experience, but really more coming into their own experiences. And that's kind of been what's been guiding my creative processes since.
That's so neat to hear. Listening to you talk, I first of all, I'm caffeinating myself, which might not be the best idea, but I just spiral out with so many, ideas and wants to respond, because you're obviously an honest guy, or at least you seem to endeavor to be, and I really do appreciate that. And what I can say as a consumer of some of your creative works is that I would agree with your evaluation, in that I really did internalize one kind of commonality in a lot of what I've read of yours and watched of yours, and that is, and to be fair, for anybody listening, participated in. I actually was able to be an extra in your movie, The Flamingos, which was a very cool experience. But to make the point, the idea of producing more media than one consumes. And I had not been really given that idea conceptually until your work, or at least I didn't, hadn't digested it. And I guess I'm going on this diatribe in an effort to say thank you for that, because that's been very helpful for me to, get to a place where I can really kind of have a diet of, media in versus media out. And as soon as I kind of got to that age, I'm 33 now, and I think that transition period between like 27 and 33, from what I've read and certainly from my experience, is kind of a big growing up period. And I'm kind of just getting on the other side of it, where, I'm pretty stable in society and with my family, and I've kind of made the life that I choose. And now I'm able to really enter into the greater circulation in a more stable way. And I believe that I have to thank a lot of the individuals like yourself who've come before, and maybe not, as you say, in a personal way, that is to say, in a way that is, an examination of your own self, as much as it is a creative way, an expressive way, an artistic way, right? Where it's not about you as an individual, it's about maybe a communication of kind of the lessons that you've learned from your experiences. And I'm a voice here to tell you that that's very much appreciated.
Well,
It's been helpful, so thank you.
well, you're welcome. One of the things that I've had quite a few inspirations along the way, not just from my own thinking processes, but often from a series of poets that I've followed along the way. And when I was in my early 20s, I was reading a lot of William Blake, and there was one particular quote that kind of stuck with me, almost like a credo, or some kind of way of understanding my experience. And that quote was that the fool that persists in his folly becomes wise. And the way I've interpreted that is that through and I'm just talking about my own experience, but through my own commitment, my full-on commitment to my most personal experiences, if I follow it all the way through and don't hold back and just keep following all the way through, at some point the personal breaks into the universal. And each time I do that, it's unpredictable. I don't know when it's going to break into a more universal point, but I do recall how each time it started with the personal. And so I tried to do my best to stay close to what is personal to me. And especially in the current culture, it helps me act, helps a kind of, what's the word? It gives me a kind of immunity to the toxicity of the culture, to stay in touch with what is actually personal to me. And the reason I think that is the case is that one of the consequences of constantly consuming more images or more media than you're creating yourself is a kind of depersonalization process. And the more people become depersonalized, or they start losing touch with what is actually most personal to them, so they start losing touch with a sense of personhood or their capacity simply to have an experience that's not influenced by that TV show or this book or that teacher or this particular system of metaphysics or whatever. Where is that moment where you're actually able to have an experience that is personal to you, that in a sense, you're just under the influence of your own energy, under the influence of your own God, under the influence of your own sources. And so that has been an ongoing kind of point of focus for me, also very related to staying close to a sense of immediacy and, what is it like to be able to, just basically to stay present and be accountable for my responses to what's happening.
I hear that. To be clear, when you use the word immediacy, do you mean a sense? I'm conflating it with the word urgency, and I mean to give you the question in that I don't know that I'm interpreting the word correctly.
Well, I think urgency refers to a more melodramatic or dramatic expression. Immediacy is simply that, is a word I use to describe the present moment as I know it in the here and now, as minimally mediated as possible. And what I mean by mediated, mediation includes my ideas about what's happening, my interpretations about what's happening, my beliefs about what is happening, my assumptions, all of that tends to mediate my experience. And so as I minimize mediation, as I relax the tendency to interpret my experience or to try to make meaning or create meaning or search for meaning, as I kind of relax all that, there comes into my consciousness a very simple way of seeing and knowing, without necessarily having words to articulate it. However, because right now, obviously, we're speaking, we have to find words, I've had to really rethink the use of words and rethink thinking so as to better serve experience, so as to how do I find a way to, in a sense, allow it's kind of a training, a kind of how do I train my intellect to follow the dictates of intuition so that my intuition guides me and I come into a kind of nonverbal impression of whatever's happening. And then afterwards, my intellect chimes in and says, oh, this is what's happening, or this might be happening. And I like to keep it like that because if I follow the dictates of intellect alone, I pretty much end up trapped in a kind of mental house where I end up looking at everything from behind a plate glass window and I'm experiencing nothing.
I've certainly had that, or what I interpret that experience to be myself, kind of trapped by dogma. I've just watched one of the interviews that you had with the gentleman. I don't remember his name, but he was associated with Steve Jobs. When I looked him up, and it was an interview you had given almost a decade ago, and you were speaking on the 8th Circuit brain and all these different. There's several chopped up versions from the long interview on YouTube. And one of the things that you guys spoke about and a common theme in some of your works and something that's helped me a lot and something that's won me some arguments to be fair, is the concept of, the map not being the territory, the menu not being the meal, right? The relevance of direct experience as opposed to our abstracted out, scaffolded logic chain ideas about that experience. And the thing that I got from this interview that I had watched with you, that you had with this gentleman, that was another piece to the puzzle was, you guys both were kind of saying, oh yeah, the map is not the territory, and chuckling. And then you kind of one-upped him and you said, well, unless you're a fundamentalist. And that kind of hit me, and I go, oh, that's fascinating. In that I think it's there's a trapdoor, I suppose, in any, this is my own thinking, in any intellectual pursuit. Certainly, I always mix up the two words, exacerbated or exasperated, but certainly even made more intense by people, I would argue, that get higher up in whatever it is, whether it's academia or when they kind of have a component of their self, their identity locked in how much accolade they get and so forth from the community, and that can serve as almost a prison. And I would make the connection between academia in that sense, and maybe some schools of religion that are let's say in this hypothetical farther away from that direct experience of the mystical or whatever was the original inspiration for it. And that really helped me to think critically about a lot of these concepts, and that telling anybody that's struggling with a framework for understanding the world around them, right? And you're teaching them physics, or they're learning this or that or the other thing, and then you introduce this concept of, hey, your experience is still what it is. All this other stuff is representational. All this other stuff, Newtonian physics is just telling you where the ball is going to land, but when you throw the ball, it's still, you know what I mean? And that was really a neat thought for me to try to explore. And so I too have tried to bolster myself against group identity, against the want for status in any way. Believe me, it's been a struggle, because I can kind of be a shithead in certain instances where towing the line is paramount. But I do feel that it's given me a great deal of personal sovereignty and autonomy in the deepest sense. And I think that that's a really beautiful concept. And so I just wanted to share that with you, that I just randomly found that. And I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I'm learning to have more compassion for those suffering from the illusion of certitude, and where a kind of misplaced security need occurs, where people are really trying to find the answers. They're struggling because they don't know how to permit more uncertainty during times of accelerating uncertainty, such as we're in right now, in this massive social isolation era, where we're kind of in the middle of this major reset, like this right. Huge reset button has been pushed. And so we all are having the opportunity of coming to face ourselves, face the consequences of our actions, of our beliefs, of our ideas. We're discovering how well we can actually live with ourselves in the solitude, or if you're with a partner, how well you can actually live with them. We're discovering quite a bit, and I think this is really an important time period. And I'm not talking here, with any kind of flippancy or disrespect for the, for those who are, gravely ill and dying, because that is also happening. But it's more of kind of a observation of a larger picture, as far as I can see, larger pictures, that we're in this giant reset, this giant period where basically the world has stopped. And so this process of stopping the world coincides with activation of the planet. The world and the planet are not the same in my mind. They've never been the same thing in my mind. The world is being stopped right now. The planet is becoming more active, more healthy. It's the ozone uh, areas, the atmosphere, the waters are having a greater opportunities to circulate and regenerate itself when the world has stopped. And so, um, yeah, I guess like many people, I'm bouncing back and forth between my own personal experience of being alone and then wondering what it might be like for, millions, billions of other people at the same time.
Yeah, I mean that's a lot. That's a lot to try to take in. I'm kind of staggered by that. I've certainly tried to get my head around what's happening, and I don't contend to be any expert on the subject. I've listened to as many experts that I can, Dr. Fauci and Bill Gates, and TED Talks are having neat online interviews with experts on the daily, and there's a lot. It gives me great heart. It gives me a lot of good feeling directly in the face of the fact that there's terrible tragedy happening in human suffering, and that can't be discounted by all of the helpers, all of the people that are pulling up their sleeves and trying to get a handle on the situation, and working really diligently and working together. That's the thing that gets me going. And as an aside, there's a creative artist who makes music named Akira the Dawn. He calls himself Akira the Dawn. He's on YouTube, and he makes these songs where he has kind of an electronic bass song, and then he has vocals by these really neat people, Terrence McKenna, Alan Watts, Jocko Willink, David Goggins, these people that really have good messages to share with the rest of us. And he did a album or a song with vocals from Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers. And what he said was that Fred Rogers' mother told him when he was a child that anytime you watch the television and there's some kind of catastrophe, look for the helpers, because if you see the helpers, you'll know that there's hope. And that's something that has stuck with me, in that I don't have a great deal of, at least I feel, power to change the macro course of this viral pandemic of this COVID-19, and yet I do, in my little corner of the world, have the capacity to be a helper, and that instantly brings me out of my what I realize to be little view of myself, where I'm an EMT, which is low level emergency medical professional as you can be, but it means that I have the opportunity to go and help monitor people for symptoms. And I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I think you're really onto something there, because I've seen quite a bit of this starting to happen already, where the enforced solitude. I mentioned something about people being in the opportunity of facing themselves, but specifically, I think this is a really great time to reflect on your contribution. What is it that you have to offer to get more clarity on your particular talent, your particular gift, your particular offering, what you have to contribute to the community, to the world, to other people. And once that becomes more clear, then when we return to community life, and it's not about returning back to normal, there's no such thing as returning back to normal, but there is a return to the community. But you can return to the community with more clarity around what it is that you're contributing, what you have to offer. Now, this kind of hit me personally, because I had scheduled a world premiere of my film here in Portland at the Clinton Street Theater for March 28th. That was yesterday. Well, obviously it had to be canceled because of the epidemic. And I was wondering, oh my God, we've done all this work to make this film and now nobody can see it. So what I decided to do instead was to post the film on YouTube for free for anybody in the whole world that wants to see it. And I had never really done that before, had premiered my film in that way. And it's been kind of extraordinary because it's only been on YouTube now for not 8 or 9, maybe 10 days, and it's already gotten, I think, 1,000 views and all these people responding. So it's been very rewarding to do that. And anybody can watch the film. If you go to YouTube and you put in the search engine The Vanishing Field, maybe my last name, Alli, it's sure to come up. And if you can't find it that way, you can go to my website, verticalpool.com, and you'll find the link there. But this is really interesting, this transition from, presenting how I define my contribution. I contribute in several ways. As you've mentioned, I've written books and I've, created theater, and I make music with my wife. But currently, I would say probably my most personal point of contribution and what I feel might be of the greatest value for others, and that's just a certain conceit of mine. I'm just assuming that it's a value for others, primarily because that's what they tell me. It's not because I think that on my own. That would be my films. And in fact, I've now made available all my films for free viewing on YouTube, and you can find that link also on verticalpool.com.
Weirdly, I think that The Vanishing Field, the most recent film, is hyper relevant to what we're going through right now. And I wonder if the subject matter of your films, as you say, how there's some kind of veiling or artistic representation of personal experience, and maybe that's all that film can be, right? Because what else do we have access to? But the idea, certainly with respect to the story arc that Jacob takes in the film, is I think exactly what we're speaking to. A young man disillusioned with what's going on, feeling trapped, feeling like everything's over, which is a very real metaphor for what's going on right now. And then, I think maybe people are, certainly from what I'm seeing from the memes, which is often a good distillation of kind of what people are thinking. You see people, leaning into their alcoholism while they're in solitude, or leaning into this or leaning into that. And I think to make the connection to the film, the protagonist, without giving any spoilers or anything like this, kind of finally, how can I say, goes through that same journey of coming back to the self. And I think that I'm sorry.
Well, what he does there is that, the beginning of the film starts out, we find out he's a vlogger, and he's a vlogger called Jacob X. And he's, like you said, he's talking about really feeling done with the world as it is. He wants to disappear. He wants to be gone. And he's trying to figure out all these ways in which he can do that. And then he finally settles on the decision to join a monastery and become a Zen monk. And that's pretty much where the story begins. However, his journey takes a series of unexpected turns where he does find disappearance, but at a consequence that he had not ever considered. And that's where the spoiler is. I'm not going to be talking about that. But there's another film of mine, too. The Book of Jane came out in 2013 that also is strangely prescient or relevant to the times. And it seems that this is something that I've been told by others. I had not really thought of it myself, but my films sometimes tend to forecast future scenarios without me intending them to. And I don't really know how or why that happens. It's just, in a sense, part of my creative process is really, if I can romanticize here a little bit, is really one of following the call of the muses. And I take the muses to heart, and I don't call them my muses. They don't belong to me. I relate to the muses as an autonomous archetype. And I have, over the years, come into a personal relationship with the archetype of really one of receptivity, where again, it's not like I own it, it's not my muse, but somehow I've discovered some way of living, some way of thinking, an outlook that enables me to hear their call, shall we say.
Is there some sort of ceremony or sacrament or ritualized, activity or process? Is there some kind of like yogic, activity that sets the stage, so to speak, for your communion with these muses, or what? How does that happen? Out of
Well,
curiosity.
that's a really great question. I would not call it a communion. There have been quite a few group ritual experiments I've been conducting over the last 10 years dedicated to the exploration of the muse archetype. And people can find out more about that if they go to paratheatrical.com. There's a link down there on that page that refers to the Muses dialogue. But, I can't say there's one particular ceremony. And as I mentioned, I certainly don't commune with them. I tried that in the beginning of my research, communing with that energy. And it was just a burnout experience. That the archetype had far more power than my ego could contain. And it took me a few days to recover. And when I did, I realized that that one does not marry the muses. One does not form a marriage or communion with the muses. It's more of a kind of a dialogue, or a kind of a two-way interaction. I send a call out and I hear a call come back. It's kind of a call and response process. But again, that can be, I can understand how that can be kind of vague or abstract to anybody listening to this. But another name for the muses, let's say the term the daemon, not the demon, the daemon, Daemon. Google that. There's a mythology around the daemon that I find that's parallels the muses archetype as I've come to know it.
What's the fantasy film with the alethiometer, and they all have daemons? Oh gosh, I want to say the Clockwork Orange, but that's not what it is. It's there's a young girl and she travels to the north, and there's the ice bears, and everybody has a daemon. I can't think of the name of that. Do you remember the name of it?
No, I don't. But you see, again, it's not like we have a daemon. Again, that expresses propriety. One does not own the archetype. It's more like the archetype owns us. And then we have to find a way to extricate ourselves from the thing that owns us, because that just leads to a kind of weird obsession or a weird possession state. And it's not really conducive to creating so much. It can kind of corrupt the talent to become overly owned by any archetype. So I think any artist that is inspired to create has some kind of interaction with the muses archetype, even though they may not be aware of it. They may not call it like that. I've managed to call it what I call it simply because I've been working in the area of group ritual dynamics for so long. I've had to find language to communicate with the groups that I'm working with, what the hell we might be doing here in this session here.
Sure.
And the experiments that I'm talking about with these groups, they would last 10 weeks, 2.5 months at a stretch. And so over the last 10 years, we conducted, I think, 4 or 5 of these. So there's quite a bit of time that's invested. So, you multiply 10 weeks times 4 or 5. So like 40 to 50 weeks of this process that kind of drummed into my unconscious, drummed into my nervous system, drummed into my thinking apparatus, the possibility of interaction with autonomous archetypes. They're autonomous because they have a life of their own. They come and go on their own. It's not like they're on my watch. It's more like I'm on their watch, that sort of thing.
It's so interesting. From what little I've come to understand about like Jungian psychology, that there's a commonality there, right, in terms of the archetypes. Weirdly, I have a question with respect to the formality in which the paratheatrical work, which I think you're referring to, took place and under your watch was conducted. Would you go so far as to say the same dynamics happen all the time? Like, are you aware of the same kind of archetype enter and exit from stage left or right in just everyday life at the the grocery store or something, for lack of a better what I mean? Does it pervade mundane interactions?
Well, I don't know if I'd be the best person to answer that. Part of the long-term influence or consequence on my nervous system, on my way of experiencing the world as a result of 40 plus years doing this paratheatrical process, has pretty much messed up any kind of notion of the mundane and the cosmic as being separate.
Sure, that's interesting to hear.
Yeah, my awareness is that they're always intersection. They're constantly intertwined. It's hard for me to understand anything as just purely mundane or purely cosmic.
I loved the quote that you said about yourself at the beginning of, I believe, 8 Circuit Brain. And you said, if you allow me to paraphrase, I'm not a person with their head in the clouds. I'm a person that's been entirely, my whole body has been consumed by the clouds. I always, that made me chuckle, because I just think that's a beautiful, beautiful sentiment. It's like, if there's this idea that we can be fantastical or be inhabited by something higher than us, well, why the heck not? Go for it, right? Blast off. I mean, what's there to lose but our sanity? So I don't know. I really thought that was a beautiful thing.
Well, thank you. The paratheatrical work, I have to say, it's not for everybody. It's not a kind of a populist medium. It's not subject to franchise or anything like that. In fact, my guess is that maybe if people read about it online or read about it from my book, I have a book on it called Towards an Archaeology of the Soul. Maybe 10% of those people might be interested in the idea of it, and maybe 1% of that 10% would actually start experimenting and doing anything to see for themselves, some of the influence that might occur. The quote about being consumed by clouds refers to actually the crux method of paratheater, something referred to as no form, the cloud of unknowing. And this method is borrowed from Zazen sitting practice. However, in the paratheater work, it's implemented standing, not sitting. And its relationship to the no form event is also different from traditional Zazen, in that in paratheater work, we don't look to the no form experience as any kind of end all spiritual journey towards samadhi or enlightenment. In fact, the no form experience is simply related to as a tool to induce enough internal receptivity to begin detecting sources of energy in the body itself as movement resources, so that we can come under the influence of our own energy and give that influence physical, vocal, gestural, and interactive expression. And then after each of those embodied expressions, we return to the no form stance to discharge and disidentify with whatever it is that came out from the body itself, and we return to receptivity afterwards. And this is part of the formality of the paratheatrical process as I've come to know it, is the formality of no form, of being able to stand in a state of receptivity, engage the body's energies, give them expression, fulfillment, sometimes catharsis, and then return to the no form stance. And this is what makes it formal, meaning it's a consistent structure that we adhere to. And we adhere to it so that we can allow greater access to the internal landscape, but also to discharge the energies afterwards so as to minimize the ego inflation that can naturally come around from being shot up with ourselves by being given full access to the unconscious, and it comes forth and it floods forth, and we walk around embodying God forms or embodying elementals or embodying this and that. And why it's so important that after those big, fat, meaningful experiences, we return to being nobody but ourselves.
That's beautiful. I suppose I would go so far as to contend that I am one of the 1% of the 10%. And I don't know why, but what my limited understanding of the practice has given me is, and I'm pretty physical. I've always been an athlete, and that's a lens through which I can take on difficulties in my life in a way that I feel I can rise to the challenge. And socially, interpersonally, when I've had traumas, as we all do, I'm sure, and difficulties to deal with, and my own demons, DEMONs, the idea that I can go into a place that is not, how can I say, the way that I can escape my own story and pitfalls of that story to then kind of work through the internal has been very, very, very helpful. It's I mean, I don't know. I certainly don't contend to be any thing beyond just a very novice practitioner, but I'm super stoked to dive into the concept, and I really appreciate you talking about your work, because how wonderful. I would contend a lot of the things that are like instantly popular, like hot yoga and yogic breathing and psychological self-reflection, all of these things that I would argue are almost precipitations of the cloud of that direct experience of paratheater. I really do think, for what it's worth, that what you're speaking to, and I wonder if you agree, disagree, or otherwise, I can only imagine the transformations that you've seen people go through, and I would wonder about yourself as well, has just been overwhelming. And yeah, to kind of tie off the point, the commonality that I've seen, and one of the reasons that I continue to be intrigued by your work and by paratheater as a concept and no form and so forth, is that I see a really adamantium thread to things that I believe are as well really, really powerful for individuals to explore, and that is the idea of the hero's journey, the idea of going into going through the fall, going through the underworld, facing chaos, rescuing our father from the belly of the beast. And I've listened to, Jordan Peterson and a lot of intellectuals and kind of mystic thinkers. And the thing that is so encouraging to me is that, as opposed to kind of getting lost in the weeds, I so often am brought back to a deeper understanding of things that I've been intrigued by earlier. It's as if they're all attempts to speak to the same thing, the same experience. And I am just very grateful. I'm very grateful that there exists the ability to face our own difficulties, to find other unique perspectives on our own stories, to overcome trauma, all the things that we all, I suppose, have to do at some point. And I would argue, again, just to kind of tie up the point, that your work in paratheater is a really direct avenue to that process.
Well, thank you. Again, it doesn't seem like this work is for everybody, but what I have seen, and you mentioned something about, the transformations people undergo, and it must be overwhelming to witness that. Not so much overwhelming, but heartening, where I feel,
Sure.
kind of a deep gratitude for what I see. And I'll tell you what I see that brings the most kind of gratitude or satisfaction in my own experience. And that is when people initially start doing this work, there's something really quite disturbing that every time I see it, I'm disturbed, and I don't understand why every time I'm disturbed, because I should not be disturbed if I see it over and over again, but I keep getting disturbed. It's the same thing. And that is given the opportunity for individuals in this process and the opportunities provided to trust their own experience as a source of authority. This point has been probably the most common frustration I've seen people hit, where they're just somehow schooled or conditioned into not trusting their own experience as an authority source, as something that they can rely on to determine whether something's true, whether something's real, whether something's authentic or whatever. And so the early training in this work is really one of restoring self-trust, is one of restoring, and trust here has to be earned. It's not like a given, but so it's a process of constantly trial and error until you find your way. You find a way to start experimenting with trusting your own experience, your own direct firsthand knowledge as a source of spiritual authority. And this is really important in the work that I do with groups, because I dismiss any kind of projection people might have on me as a spiritual authority. It's a bit of a joke, I'm a flawed human being. There's nothing about a spiritual authority from anything that I do or say. To me, the true spiritual authority is going to come from your own direct experience and your capacity to listen to that, to immerse yourself in it, to distill from your own experience your own truth, and to follow that truth as a guidepost, as something that's guiding you. Whether it's right or wrong according to other people, that's their problem, that's their business. But to you, if you're following your own truth based on your own direct experience, it will lead you somewhere that's authentic to your being. It'll somehow emerge through your life as a presence that can guide you.
That's awesome. I wanted to, I guess this interview is more or less in addition to obviously you taking the time and giving us such insight into so many of these wonderful things, but it's just a series of me thanking you over and over for several of the lessons I feel I've learned from some of the things that you've shared. So here's another one. One of the things that I read that you had written was a great way, or let's just say a way to accumulate more personal power is to do something that you either don't believe you can or you're not sure is possible. And again, I like to stress test ideas. I'm not one given to following, people or ideas unless they kind of resonate with what I believe to be true. And I listen to Jocko Willink, and he says the same stuff, and David Goggins says the same stuff, and Joe Rogan says the same stuff. And that's been very helpful in that, I'm tired, I don't want to work out, but I don't feel like I can. And so, you know what? If I do, I'm going to feel great. And so that was a really, really great help to read that. But I have a bunch of notes here written down, and I wanted to kind of see if any of them could pull any more wisdom from you, because I really love to hear your thoughts. You had mentioned emergence in what you had said, and another one of my great ways to take the trick in conversations, as it were, is to talk about emergency, the science of emergent principles, emergent properties, and the idea of emergence. And so I just wanted to put it to you what your thoughts are on the idea of, when many singular entities, let's call them people, or fish in a school, or birds in a flock, or cells in a tissue, or what have you, act in concert, then something superordinate to all of those is kind of birthed, unbeknownst to everyone involved. I wonder if you have any take on that from your work with paratheater, or your concert with other kind of deep thinkers. Do you have any kind of relationship with emergence, or do you have any insight you feel that is worth sharing about just kind of the concept in abstraction?
So we have 5 minutes left. I'm only good for an hour here, but
Yes, sir.
what I'd like to do is suggest a web page. I've written a 5-part manifesto called State of Emergence. And though the manifesto relates specifically to the context of paratheater, it does branch out into more cultural, more universal components of what the state of emergence might be about. And that, if you go to paratheatrical.com and you go to the main page, it has most of the links down there. You go down to near the bottom, and it will have a link that says Paratheater Manifesto or State of the Emergence, and that will it'll probably show you more than you want to know about it.
Well, that's assuming that I don't go down the rabbit hole so deep, but I appreciate that, and how funny that you've already done the work. I will look that up, and I'm interested to read your thoughts. In the waning minutes of this interview, is there anything else that you would like to speak to? We've let the audience know about the Vanishing Field that has just come out, and though is not being premiered in person in Portland, is available for free on YouTube. I will put links on all of my social media sites. Is there anything else that you'd like to let the audience know?
Just thank you, Devin, for inviting me here to talk, and it's been great hearing some of your story and the things that you've discovered, and realizing here that we're both works in progress.
That's right. And one of the things that helps me is realize that where we are relative to one another is not a battle to be fought, but is a progression that we're all taking place in. And I'm really heartened, as you use that word, I like to use that as well, by realizing that there's been good actors that have come before me that I can learn from and be helped by along my way. And then by virtue of that, I have found just recently that I have what little capacity to help others, whether it's as a coach or a trainer or what have you. And that's something that really truly is a blessing. And I think it's only after getting out of that narcissistic and youthful mentality of being the only one in this story that I've realized the power of being a helper. And again, my hat's off to you, Antero. I really appreciate your work, and I think it's only a matter of time before tens of millions of people are, for lack of a better word, because I think the word's been painted often, but awakened to a lot of the work that you and the people that have inspired you have done, because it's so helpful and so transformative, in my opinion, in the best possible sense of the word. So again, thank you very much for all of your work, and thank you for taking the time, and hope to see you in Portland one of these days in the future, certainly on the other side of this COVID thing.
Well, thank you for your contribution, Devin, and I'll see you on the flip side.
Right on. Thank you, sir.